So after a good lunch and a very interesting debate that we had on a very wide issue of global geopolitics, we are now zeroing down on a subject that is significantly more narrow, but in my view, as important in the long term as many of the geopolitical questions. That's the question of decarbonization. I think most of us understand that decarbonization is essential, that if we do not manage to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to a degree that drives us back into the early 19th century in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we face the risk of substantial climate change and potential trigger effects that might bring us to catastrophic events that we currently cannot fully appreciate. Now, having said that, those solutions that we have in mind are currently not yet fully deployable, and what we all know is that they will require massive political interventions. So if we want to go to the targets of the Paris Agreement, which essentially foresees that we are carbon neutral by the middle of the century, that would mean that there is essentially no more CO2 emissions from cars, from heating, from other forms of transport, from electricity in Europe, and that will shape the way in which our sectors operate and our economy works. Now, that will require massive policy interventions because those sectors will not easily give up the way in which they are operating. And this will not only have impact on those sectors, but also on households. And in this session here, I do not want to focus us too much on industry, but the focus of this session is really what might such an aggressive decarbonization that we think necessary until the middle of the century mean for distributional consequences between different groups of households in terms of inequality, and here I mean in the European sense. So just think about the different effects that decarbonization might have. In terms of the asset side of households, households typically own most of their assets in form of housing. This housing needs to be substantially renovated. Households' second asset class is cars, which also have to be completely replaced. And financial assets, a lot of those financial assets being in brown companies, if you might want to call them that. And also there might be substantial revaluation of those. On the income side of households, households acquired specific skills, many of them in brown sectors, especially poorer households or a lot of the brown sectors are represented by relatively lower skilled labor. And you also have different or changes in the returns to the assets that the households own. And on the expenditure side, you also will have significant shifts through to decarbonization policies. We will essentially put prices on the usage of fossil fuels that are substantial, that will benefit those that can afford cheaper vehicles that have less emissions. The heating and the electricity bills will initially potentially go up significantly. Also, the way in which the electricity bill, for example, looks like will change dramatically because when the wind is blowing, electricity might be free, but when the wind is not blowing, electricity might be quite expensive. So there is massive shifts due to decarbonization for households, both on the asset side, on the income side, and on the expenditure side. And our thinking was that some of that has been now acknowledged in some of the decarbonization policy documents, but a lot of that is not really discussed, and we wanted to take the opportunity to bring this discussion here to Brussels. Now, you might argue, okay, then if decarbonization is essentially to a large degree falling on poorer households because they cannot buy a low-emission vehicle. The investments of richer households are subsidized. If electricity prices go up and poorer households consume more electricity as a share of their income, then decarbonization might be a highly regressive policy proposal, and therefore we should not do decarbonization for equity reason. Now, that thinking is completely wrong, because climate change itself is highly regressive. So if you think about poorer households cannot as easily adapt as richer households to a changing climate. So what we are suggesting, and Bruegel is coming up with a report in the coming months on that, is that there are indeed remedies to make decarbonization policies less regressive. The first thing that we think is important is that this issue needs to be taken more into account, and then that there are compensation mechanisms, and yes, in theory, we can think about compensation mechanisms, but they are only rarely employed, so more of that needs to be done. We should think about, if we implement climate policies, about whether there's maybe an option that is less regressive than another option to do that. And also when focusing on sectors, we might think about which sectors have more regressive effects than others. Now, with this introductory statement from my side, it's my pleasure to hand it over to the panel. I think we have a very good mix here. And I would like first to give the floor to Barbara Botos. She is Deputy State Secretary for Climate Policy at the Ministry of Innovation and Technology in Hungary. And I hope can enlighten us on what Hungary has in mind.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. I think I would like to summarize my introductory part in 6 points. The first point is pretty general. The second one will be pretty global. And then the rest of them will be quite universal. So let's start with the general statement. The general statement is that the social implications of climate change don't come from the impacts of climate change, but actually from the policies that we adopt to mitigate climate change. And that's what you said, that many measures are quite regressive in their nature. They are not progressive, and they put heavy burden on certain parts of the society, especially those who are poverty-stricken. My second statement is, unless there is a global carbon price, unless there is politically and globally synchronized decarbonization, we cannot get rid of the competitiveness concerns of traditional companies. That's very important. Hungary is in a very good situation when we talk about climate policy, being the first member state of the EU who ratified the Paris Agreement. And also, we are very progressive with greenhouse gas emissions, more than 34% already done compared to 1990 levels. We will be one of the biggest sellers in the effort sharing scheme. We are going to have at least 50% of the sellable quotas, the annual emission allocations within Europe between 2020 and 2030. However, when it comes to the ETS sector, when we talk about the emission trading scheme, just within the last 10 months, the price of the ETS quota has risen fourfold, from 5 euros to 21 euros already. Just imagine what a big burden it is on all the installations that are under the European emission trading system. And I always keep emphasizing that it's especially a big burden for Hungary, which is at the edge of the European Union. And when we talk about carbon leakage is not something leaking from something, but carbon leakage is actually the relocation of companies to countries which are not under the burden of any strict environmental or climate policy regulation, and it's already happening, especially in Hungary. The first sign of carbon leakage or greenhouse gas leakage is that the market share of these companies decreases because import is way cheaper. The second sign of it is investment leakage, we can experience it in Europe. Many companies make a decision not to start a new installation in Europe, but go to other countries which don't have as strict regulations. And the third part is carbon leakage, which is actually the relocation of existing companies which produces even more and higher global emissions. So that's why I said in my second point that unless we have global carbon price, unless we have globally synchronized decarbonization, we cannot solve the competitiveness problem. And now let's go deeper down to those people who suffer the most, because that's the topic of today's discussion. And that's how we can make this discussion even more universal. Just a few details about Hungary. Hungary, as you know, is a traditionally energy-dependent country. 80% of gas, 90% of oil, 30% of electricity. So we are import dependent. Don't believe any Hungarians who say that we can make this undone. We cannot be independent of import. This is something we have to live with. However, we can deal with it. We can diverse the energy mix. We can diverse the portfolio. And if there is a diverse portfolio, there is market, a booming market, and if there is a booming market, then the prices might go down. And that's what really helps households if prices go down. So I come from the Ministry of Innovation and Technology. It used to be the Ministry for National Development. So this has a new name, but this new name means a lot. And it also means that we think that climate change and energy transition has a great business development potential. And we decided to enter the champion path. We don't want to lag behind. We think that climate change can offer good business solutions and innovative solutions. Hungarians have been very famous of being creative. So we would like to be in the group of forerunners. So we decided to have 4 main programs, 4 main pillars of a huge strategy, which is all about smart, clean, and payable energy. Smart, clean, and payable. And the 4 pillars that we have just identified are the following. The first is putting the consumers into the focus, or rather prosumers, because they are producers and consumers at the same time. The second pillar is the security of energy supply is very important for a country like us. The third one is how we can make the transformation of energy sector in a climate-friendly manner. And the third one is the economic business potential that is embedded in any energy transition or climate policy making. And that was number 4. And number 5 is that Hungary is committed to decarbonize. And what we have realized that emission reduction should not come hand in hand with economic downturn. Over the last 15 years, we experienced that greenhouse gas emissions can be decoupled from actually GDP growth, which is a good news. And here comes number 6. And this is something I think many people talk about. That's the future of the world, and this is massive electrification. That's what is before us, and that's why it's very important to talk about it, especially in Hungary, where we use a lot of gas, especially for heating. And this massive electrification is going to touch basically the heating sector and the transport sector. When we talk about transport sector, it's more or less e-mobility. When we talk about the heating sector, it's more about electrification of heating, which in Hungary is 97% run by gas. So when we talk about the electrification tendency, that the gross energy consumption of the world, within this gross energy consumption, the electricity share is going to grow massively. It means that there is going to be a growing demand for electricity from all segments of society. The question is if the system, the infrastructure is prepared for that. And when, on behalf of Hungary, I talk about decreasing the dependency, the important dependency, then I have to talk about decentralization. The 3 Ds, decentralization, decarbonization, and digitalization. So we do think that the future is about decentralized energy production and consumption, but also we should not forget about the new grid infrastructure that is needed to accommodate that growing demand. And here comes the consumers, and this is the end of my last point. The consumers are going to have very diverse demands based on their income level, based on their ages, based on their living circumstances. The diverse demands of consumers have to be met in this new era of electrification. And they also want freedom of choice. Freedom of choice of what source of energy and from which company they would like to get. And when there is a new consumer performance demand emerging, and that's what is happening right now, we need an energy policy. And I think each country needs differentiated energy policy for each consumer segment. And now let me just to finish my introduction by asking some questions. My questions are the following. So can we decouple energy policy from social policy? When we talk about energy prices and those poverty-stricken people who suffer the most from the regressive policies that we make, we talk about the price of energy, and we also talk about consumed energy. Shall we regulate the prices to alleviate the situation of the poor, of the energy poverty-stricken people, or shall we just have a modal shift to do it in a smart way? Can we do that in a smart way? Can we have social energy policy in a smart way? Can we introduce a new energy source which is actually consuming less? So these are the 2 factors. There will be a shift. And maybe later I can talk about why I think that there is going to be a shift between these factors of price regulation in general. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Barbara. I think you essentially did the job of Emmanuel and myself by speaking about prosumers and putting up the questions that are also very logical continuations of your presentation. I think it's very good to hear some progressive policy stance from the side of Hungary on the question of decarbonization. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Emmanuel Lagarrigue. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer of Schneider Electric, one of the leading companies that produces the hardware for the new energy world.
Thank you, and yeah, I'm very positively surprised by the opening comments of Barbara. And just to reinforce many of the points she has made, for Europe, climate change and the energy transition are a matter of geopolitics, economics, and social policies. Geopolitics, simply for the fact that 54% of the energy we consume in Europe is imported from Russia, the Middle East, North Africa. The Chinese are ready to invest in sending us more electricity. Whereas we have a lot of wind, we have a lot of sun in Europe, and the technologies to transform this wind and that sun into electricity have seen their cost decreasing a lot. I mean, we're talking about 75% decrease in the cost of solar PV over the last 8 years. So we have this strange paradigm where we still are focusing on very centralized energy systems controlled by a few companies, electrical utilities, oil and gas companies, which are replicating the systems and the strategies of the past. I mean, big pipelines or connecting lines with Africa, with a hyper-centralized energy system, mostly based on imports. Whereas we could go for more decentralization, more autonomy as Europeans when it comes to energy. So from a geopolitical standpoint, there is a very strong interest in terms of going faster in the energy transition. Second point, it's a matter of cost, right? So climate change has already cost 400 billion euros to Europe over the last 15 years. And it's just the beginning. And of course, talking about the social impact of this, guess who is going to be most impacted in that cost? Of course, the people who are most in need. And by the way, this very centralized system, which is built on importing energy, is costing us 1 billion euro per day. So we're importing 1 billion euro per day of energy. So we are reaching a point where the centralized system, which was the system we had, and we could not do anything better, technically speaking, up to now, is reaching a point where it makes no sense, where we have to shift to something which is much more decentralized and of course, much more decarbonized. Because on top of this, from a social standpoint, this current system has produced something between 50 and 120 million Europeans being either in or at the edge of energy poverty. So really the current system is taking us to a place which is not solving any problem. There's a lot of resistance from the traditional companies who see their business model being shifted, being challenged. But some of them, some utilities like Enel or Iberdrola or others, or in Germany also, have understood that. They are pretty progressive in understanding that the energy transition can be good also for their business, understanding that they need to change their business model, and of course, first and foremost for their customers. And would their customers be businesses or individual consumers? So which takes me to the point of prosumer that Barbara put on the table. So as she said, the increase of the demand of electricity will double, basically. Over the next 15 years, we will consume twice as much electricity as we consume today, because we are going to electrify transportation. We are going to electrify a series of industrial processes, mostly related to heat. We are consuming more and more IT services every day, and this is extremely electricity intensive, and so on and so forth. So the consumption of electricity will double, no matter what. Now, either we continue with that system of importing energy from outside, very carbonated, very centralized system, where at the end it's managed by a few large corporates, or we go for a really decentralized system where businesses and people take care of their energy equation and make sure that their energy is decarbonated, that they can be autonomous in the way they produce energy. And yes, it will take us to deploy new policies and new ways to do energy. And actually, in that transition towards a world of prosumer, where we are both producers and consumers of energy, Europe is late. Late versus other developed regions of the world, like Australia. 25% of households have solar panels on their roof in Australia. So it's pretty across the board. It's not only the top end of the Australian society. It's pretty democratic. The US is going faster than Europe. So regardless of the flows of tweets coming from the White House, this is not where policy is made on energy. The energy transition is happening because many businesses, many people want resiliency and want to take control of their own carbon footprint and energy production. So because of this super centralized system based on imports, we are kind of blocked and we are a bit behind other developed regions in the world. We are missing a big opportunity. I think it's Commissioner Arias Cañete who said that if between businesses and public subsidies, we were able to invest something like 180 billion euros over the next 5 years in this energy transition, we would create close to 1 million jobs in Europe, right? Because when you democratize the production of energy, when you make it local and you don't depend so much on imports, well, you don't create jobs in Russia, in the Middle East, or in North Africa, you create jobs here. To install solar panels, to size a wind farm or a solar farm, to create local energy production. So 1 million jobs and probably roughly an additional % of GDP. So this is what the energy transition could bring to us as European. Of course, in that transition, we have to make sure that all the levels of the socio-economic levels in our societies can benefit from it. And this is also a big opportunity, if we do that well, to take those 50 to 120 million Europeans who are in energy poverty today, to take them out of the energy poverty and solve that problem also for them.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and it was good to hear that there is also a lot of opportunity in the decarbonization debate for European growth in the future. Now, the floor is to Denis Benjamin, who works at the ETUC, which is an association of trade unions in the EU, and trade unions have often been criticized for being structurally conservative on some of those issues. It would be interesting to get your view.
Thank you. Indeed, I'm representing the ETUC, which is the European Trade Union Confederation. For those of you who are not familiar with the ETUC, we represent 90 national trade union confederations coming from 40 European countries, and we also represent 10 EU-wide sectorial federations. First of all, I would like to apologize Montserrat Mir, who is sick today and who is unable to be with you. I learned a couple of hours ago that I had to step in. That's why I might look a little bit underdressed. I feel better now that I can see that I'm not the only one without a tie in the room, but I hope that I will not look as unprepared as I look underdressed. I would like to start by a clarification, because it has been said that often trade unions are seen as conservative in that debate. I tend to disagree with that statement, even though, let's be frank, we have sometimes difficult conversation within our constituency, because some of our colleagues, some of the workers we represent are at the front line of decarbonization. For some of them, they work in sectors or in regions where the benefits of the low carbon economy will be more difficult to secure. But despite those difficulties, we have been for many years arguing for an aggressive decarbonization, supported by a strong social agenda. We often say that there are no jobs on the planet. Everything that the trade unions have been fighting for decades and centuries will not be possible if we do not control climate change, if we do not decarbonize at a rapid pace our economies at a global scale. Just as a matter of clarification. I think that if we start the debate on climate change by only focusing on jobs and competitiveness, it's absolutely misleading. I think that it shows that we completely misunderstand what is at stake. I will go to London tomorrow to participate to a meeting with workers from British utilities. And in preparing my slides, I've been invited to make a state of play of climate policies. I make a presentation about the Paris Agreement, and I also prepared some slides about showing temperature trends and emissions trends. And it's basically scary. I'm not speaking here as a trade union representative, but as a basic citizen, as the father of 2 young kids. I'm really scared when I see the temperature trends or an ability to reduce our emissions. Look at the emissions from the G20 countries. They have increased last year. It's absolutely scary. If we do not manage to accelerate dramatically the decarbonization, what will be at stake very soon will be our ability to keep our planet habitable. Now, having said that, the second sentence which captures what trade unions demand in this debate is just transition. We clearly say that we have to decarbonize as quickly as possible, but there are different ways to achieve that decarbonization. And when I read the title of the slide, social impact of decarbonization, that social impact will depend on how we will design, frame, and implement the climate and energy policies. In other words, the social impact will depend on what we make of climate policies, and in this case of EU climate policies. There is nothing automatic, neither on the positive side nor on the negative side. If you look at the forecasts in terms of job creation, many studies from the ILO, from the European Commission, etc., foresee that decarbonization will have a positive impact on job creation. The ILO foresees that the greening of the economy, not only decarbonization, but the transition to a sustainable economy, will create up to 24 million of jobs by 2030. And we can find similar forecasts for the EU. So obviously there is here a potential that needs to be tapped. Now, if we look at recent trends, figures, and reports, for instance, the IRENA annual employment review, it shows that the trends in the EU are not as positive as we expected a few years ago. During the last few years, from 2010 to 2015, depending a little bit on the technologies we consider, but the trends have been either negative or flat in terms of job creation in the renewable industry in Europe, because of the impact of austerity policies on households' incomes, because of the impact of austerity policies on public budget, because of dramatic change and sudden change in the support schemes and policy framework to deploy renewable, but also because of a trade policy which has led to basically the destruction of some sectors in Europe because of the import of cheap products from elsewhere in Europe. So there is no automaticity in terms of job creation, and if we want to maximize the creation of jobs in the EU while we are decarbonizing the economy, we have to ensure that we put in place the right policy framework. Now, we also have, in terms of employment, to look at the negative side of the spectrum. If you make a mapping of the consequences of decarbonization on the labor market, you will see indeed some sectors that will win, like the construction sector, the renewable sectors, etc. But you also have the other side of the spectrum, the energy-intensive industries, the extractive industries that will be strongly negatively impacted. Concrete measures must be put in place to cushion the social impact in those sectors. And this is why we have called for a Just Transition Fund in the context of the revision of the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme. This is why we have been arguing for similar devices in the context of the governance of the Energy Union and the national plans that member states will have to prepare in the coming years. We believe that in that context, a conversation must be opened or deepened in the different member states to see how exactly what concrete measures member states have to put in place to help those workers that will be negatively impacted by decarbonization, either to find a new job or simply to have access to a decent life. And there we have to mobilize a series of, I would say, classical policy instruments from the labor market policy. We might talk about retraining, upskilling programs for workers, but we will have also to mobilize in certain contexts social protection systems. What is also important to take into account is the quality of employment. We can see that in many, I would say, traditional sectors, you have sectors that are covered by collective agreements. You have a high rate of affiliation to trade unions, and therefore, as a result, the working conditions, the employment conditions are significantly higher than in other sectors in society. Let me just give you one example. In Poland, the monthly gross salary in the coal mining industry is up to 40% above the salary in other manufacturing sectors in Poland. So if you want to have a decent and open conversation about decarbonization with those workers, you of course have to ensure that the jobs they might be able to find in other sectors will be equivalent in terms of salary, in terms of employment condition. Otherwise, it's quite complicated for them to accept to jump in the black hole, I would say, from what they have to what they could have if it's not seen as positively. Now, two other points to finish. Energy poverty. It's of course a major concern for trade unions. We know that nowadays up to around 11% of EU households are in a situation of energy poverty, with big differences among member states. It goes up to almost 40% in Bulgaria. So this must be taken into account. We have seen some progress in the clean energy package, but a lot has to be done. And this is also another topic to be tackled in the policy planning exercises that member states will have to fulfill in the coming years. And regarding the distributional effects of current climate policies, I agree we lack systematic data, but we have been informed of a very interesting report published in 2017 in the Netherlands, commissioned by the Dutch trade unions and the Milieu Defensie, which is a green NGO. And that report is really interesting because it shows that the lower income households pay up to 5% of their available income to cover costs which are induced by climate policies. It's more than 3 times above what the richer households pay. So it shows you how regressive certain climate policies can be. But again, and to conclude my little introduction, there is nothing automatic, there is nothing natural. Climate policies, socially speaking, will be what we will make of it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Denis. I think what your statements all showed is, as always in economic and political questions, that there are trade-offs. And maybe to highlight one of the trade-offs that Barbara started out as a question, she was saying we essentially would need a new market design for the electricity sector that, at the one hand, makes sure that we have a social policy component being dealt with. At the same time, we need a lot of energy efficiency, and this policy design potentially should be targeted to the particular environment in a certain country, while at the same time we have European rules for electricity markets. So there's probably a very fine line to work to get to such a market design. And currently in the European Union we are discussing a new electricity market design, and I would be very interested to hear your thoughts, whether you think that it's taking this approach into account, or whether you're thinking that that's more of the old system that Emmanuel described, that enshrines a system that is relatively centralized. Another trade-off that that I found quite interesting from what Denis was saying is that in decarbonization we will have effects both on the side of employment with the brown jobs potentially losing out, and at the same time we will have effects on the side of consumption with environmental cost potentially increasing stronger for poorer parts of the population. Now, if you think about compensating measures, like, for example, for brown companies in terms of free allowances or in terms of carbon leakage prevention tools, they typically increase the cost for poor households additionally. So there is some trade-off between the two sides of society, and that's something we might want to look deeper into. And finally, on a statement of Emmanuel, he was saying that distributed solutions might offer quite some interesting perspective going forward. But I was wondering to some degree whether they are really solving the issue of distributional consequences, because if I am thinking about distributed solutions, I'm thinking about somebody who owns his house, who is able to put a smart installation there, who has sufficiently high electricity consumption. So does that really solve the problem of the poor person that has to deal with significantly higher electricity costs? I would leave one round on the panel with these three questions, and then I'll give it to you.
Maybe two areas where I can answer your thoughts or questions. One is gas consumption. As I told you, in Hungary, gas consumption is pretty high as in the real gas producing, gas extracting countries, so it's unusually high. However, gas consumption in Hungary seems to go down. And if it goes down, the infrastructure still needs its maintenance, but if I need to maintain the infrastructure when it's not used, it's a huge cost. So the question is, who bears the cost? What happens in those peripheral parts, in the margins of the country, where the gas infrastructure is hardly used at all? Shall I still maintain it? Or shall I put incentives so that they would shift from the use of gas to other forms of energy sources in a decentralized manner? So that's an issue for many countries like Hungary to consider, to replace or maybe to get rid of those parts of the infrastructure in the field of gas which are not needed at all. The other issue is the regulation of prices. So, as I said, there are two components, the price and how much energy is used. In the previous 8 years, we were in a good situation because the global energy prices went down. However, now they are going up 25%, especially gas. So if they go up, then it's not easy to regulate prices for those who are energy poverty stricken. So what can we do with it, with this issue? So how can we help those who are aggravated the most to consume less? Can we have different packages? Can we have basic packages of services, whatever services? So basic packages for which we ask for an affordable price, and anything which is more, which is a multi-component package. If you have solar, if you have an electric car, and if you need a plug-in system within your garage, then it might be a higher price that is offered by those who provide the services. So maybe we can think of this double solution and still help those who need help, and also provide more professional and multi-component services for profit, which is also good for companies, because in the long run, we need to preserve the profitability of all the energy value chain within each country. So this is, I think, a question that we everybody has to, each country has to investigate, because there is double pressure on energy prices for households, and the first pressure I already mentioned, the global energy price increase, and the second pressure is the higher and higher maintenance cost of the infrastructure. So under this pressure, double pressure, we have to re-evaluate how we approach energy poverty, and that's how we can urge people to take part in the regulation of the energy market. And this is a multiplayer environment that can, maybe it could be a good approach to solve energy poverty.
Two comments. First, on the creation of employment. For every megawatt hour of renewable energy produced, and I'm not talking only about utility scale, it's also on the roof of a house or the roof of a factory, you're creating as many jobs as if in all the other energy sectors combined, right? So, and the proof of this is that Germany, which has managed to power its economy to the tune of 36% in the first half of 2018, so 36% of the energy consumed in Germany, or the electricity consumed in Germany, was renewable this year so far. In Germany, there are as many people working in renewable as in all the other energy sectors combined. So it's happening. It's possible. Now, to Denis' point, we have to make sure that we manage carefully the transition and the upskilling of people who were working in the old centralized import focused energy system and go to this and work in this new decentralized, decarbonized and prosumer world of energy. I'm not so worried about the quality of jobs, because we're talking about local jobs with added value. There is space to create value, but definitely we need to secure that transition. And as a technology supplier, this is what we do. We are training constantly people to those new businesses of sizing or installing a solar system. We trained, I think, something like 10,000 people last year in France. So, first point, on the job market, it's as long as we are careful and we manage the transition, it's possible and it's positive. To your questions on the affordability, look, we are, because it's probably the most advanced market today, we have a lot of experience in Australia. And today what's happening, what we see in Australia, people become prosumers when they see their economic income diminish. So what the typical case of an Australian household is a household who is going to retire, so they know that their income is going to decrease. Their energy bill is extremely high, and they say, well, maybe I should switch to solar. And today there are solutions, because it's relatively easy to finance or to subsidize a solar installation. They don't need to put the money up front, to put the capex up front, so it's happening. So we could perfectly envision something similar in Europe, where either through distribution mechanisms led by regions or national governments, or at European level, or through financing models, because many institutions in the financial world today are ready to finance those assets, because they know it's good for the economy and it's good for the decarbonization of the economy. So there are solutions to make sure that not only the higher income households are the ones benefiting from that energy transition and decarbonization.
I'm not sure I will answer exactly your two questions, but maybe two additional comments. One on the electricity market design and energy poverty. We have been We have joined a platform called the Right to Energy platform with a series of NGOs, social NGOs, green NGOs, and other stakeholders. And among the demands we have, we would like to oppose the demand to completely phase out the regulated price. We don't say that regulated price should be or is the silver bullet, but we know by experience from a series of actors working from people in poverty or at risk of poverty that in some contexts, in specific situation, regulated price is the most quick, efficient tool that public authorities have in their hands to tackle very urgent issues. Of course, we agree that the best option is to work to reduce the energy bill through energy savings, energy efficiency measures, but the timing we are talking about is not the same. We are talking about measures that take years to produce their effects, whereas sometimes you have to face with situation where people need an answer in the coming weeks or months, and in that case we believe that when it makes sense, public authorities should be allowed to use regulated price. We also oppose disconnection because we believe that disconnection immediately leads people in great poverty and even worse in precariousness. It has been reminded that electricity consumption is increasing. Electricity and energy consumption is crucial to have a decent life, heating your home, having access to transport, but also having access to society. If you do not have electricity, you are not able anymore to consult your emails, you are not able anymore to pay your invoices from home, etc., etc. So access to energy is a crucial requirement to have access to society as a whole. So that's why in the context of the platform right to energy, we oppose disconnection, and we oppose also the phasing out of regulated price. In terms of labor transition, it's funny to see in the debate on decarbonization how suddenly employment and workers become important for a series of actors who in other debates I would say do not care at all about workers. We can see some corporate lobbyists who defended decision to close down overnight plants, decisions which have driven 10,000 of workers in precariousness. You can see the same people now shouting and almost tearing because climate policy would have a negative impact on employment, or could have in the future an impact on employment. We believe that this is a game that we shouldn't play. We can see also many companies highly benefiting from the current EU climate policy. It has been well documented that the windfall profit in the context of the ETS is real, evidence-based, etc., unlike the so-called carbon leakage, which is something that doesn't exist if you make an ex-post analysis. If you make an ex-ante analysis, it's obvious that it will be extremely complicated for the EU to be fully decarbonized in 3 decades if other major economies do not do the same at the same pace, obviously. So in that context, we have to carefully look at TDIs and other possible measures available. But pretending that climate policies have significantly destroyed jobs in the EU, we believe that this is not true. And the same, it's funny to see some populists in the EU or elsewhere in the world having, macho King Kong attitudes, pretending that they protect and defend workers because they defend coal, whereas actually they defend most of the time less than 1% of the labor market. In the US, you have 60,000 coal miners. So pretending that because you defend coal, in the US, you defend employment. It's the biggest, one of the biggest fake news, and there are many circulating for the moment. And it's really important for us to be here today and to convey that message. You don't need to oppose employment and climate change to defend workers' rights. We believe that both have to go hand in hand. There is a space to build a socially fair, a socially just transition towards a low-carbon economy, and this is really crucial nowadays.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I think we've you had some perfectly provocative statements on in terms of regulated prices in a room full of economists. So maybe we can open the discussion here. So one question in the back and some microphones.
Yeah, we had the Paris Agreement in 2015. Now we're 3 years later, and in Belgium we had the hottest summer ever. So in the meantime, the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And Mr. Trump says it's fake news, the climate change. So how many planets do we need to live the way we are living and the way we are consuming energy? As Overshoot Day this year was already mid-August. So and considering the anticipated population explosion in 2050, we will be 8 billion. In 2100, 12 billion on this planet. So my provocative question, isn't it hardly time to put together a global energy stakeholder platform to put pressure on political decision-making in order to speed up the process of decarbonization? Thank you.
Yuri Shiko, Deutsche Welle. I have a question to Ms. Botos and Mr. Lagarrigue. So you said about decentralization, but there is another trend, you know, there are efforts to decrease electricity production by coal and nuclear power plants, yes, and but that brings that more gas will be used to cover for that. And actually it also coincides with the rhetoric by Gazprom, which claims that Europe will be buying even more gas in the future. So do you see such a threat that there will be even more centralization, because gas is quite a centralized sphere? And if so, then how to counteract to that threat? Thank you.
Maybe just one, if I may, one comment. So I would like to keep the discussion productive, to stick a bit to the topic of social implications of decarbonization. So if you could react in that manner.
So again, if you think of the energy system as a centralized system controlled by a few companies, where the energy is produced in a central point and then distributed to people who would take it without much choice of how carbonized the energy is, then gas is a transition fuel after nuclear and coal. Now, what we're saying is that this centralized system, depending on imports, is not the system we want for the future, because the prosumer system, where you produce and consume your own energy, you decide on how carbonated your energy is going to become, how local your energy is going to be in the future. This is the future. And technologically speaking, and from a cost standpoint, it's possible. So we don't necessarily need to go through this transition towards gas. That's true that a year ago, 2 years ago probably, that it was very difficult to imagine a future of energy without these transitions through gas. Now, because the renewable technologies have decreased in price so fast, and because there have been so many advances in the sector of renewables, now we can imagine a future where this is not happening, where we don't need to go through gas. And as long as we are ready to have a market design which is not about centralized distribution systems.
Just an answer to the first question. The withdrawal of the USA from the Paris Agreement is something we are not happy about. However, it triggered a lot of state-level initiatives. So just my bigger son, when he went to school and he was telling his friends, my mom works on climate change and the Paris Agreement. Nobody had a clue what the Paris Agreement was about. But after Trump's withdrawal, everybody knew what his mom was dealing with. So this is something that that was in the mass media. It was in the barrage of media attention. Everybody talked about what the global effort is needed to tackle climate change. And my colleagues currently are in Bangkok discussing the Paris rulebook and the text that we can discuss in Katowice in Poland in December at COP24. So sometimes steps can trigger other steps that as you said, that even within the US, just look at the state of California, which they actually overreached their target already that they set for 2020. So something is happening there, and it's good that we talk about it. Just answering the other question, I agree with my colleague that gas is something transitionary. If you look at Hungary's energy strategy, which dates back to 2011, it said coal, nuclear, and solar, or renewable. But now we say gas instead of coal. And everybody knows that this is a coal phase-out period. And coal, for example, in Hungary, 10% of the greenhouse gas emission is produced by one single company that is run on lignite. And even they are in the barrage of media attention because they have just announced that they are going towards a transition. There are 2,000 people affected in that mining region. Of course, 500 of them will retire by the time the transition happens, because transition always ends in phase out. Another 500 people might find jobs on their own, but there are still 1,000 people in a region like that, which need to be dealt with. And when the government deals with a power plant like that, which takes such a big percentage of greenhouse gas emissions, then we always talk to trade unions. We always go to local people, what they think about it, and everybody says, we want to stay here. We want to live here. It doesn't matter what we are going to do, what jobs we are going to find, but we want to stay here. So we know that we need to provide jobs to them. We need to enlarge the industrial park, maybe to attract new companies to that place so that they could be upgraded and trained for other jobs, because they want to spend the rest of their time in those villages. And we have to respect that, and we have to prepare that. I come from a very traditional mining region. My father, my grandfathers were miners. So I remember when I was a child, I was the only child when I went to competitions who said, good luck. We always said good luck to each other. Miners said good luck to each other before they went down. And I also remember how this region collapsed at the end of the 90s, how we had to convert a city from the dirty dozen, dirty dozen, the dirty most polluting cities in Hungary, into something that is now the most developing industrial city in Hungary. It took 15 years, so it's not happening overnight. 15 years, unemployment was 17%, including my relatives. Now it's 4%, because the biggest European companies are in that city. But it meant that the city management had to prepare for that. The one window economic development agency was set up. So if somebody is coming to that region, it takes only one institution, one window to go through to get all the licenses to settle in that place. So we need to prepare these regions for just transition. We need to talk to people, we need to understand their needs, and we need to tailor the political steps so that we could help them in this transition period.
So Our time is, of this session is up, and I would like to leave you with one thought from this panel. That is that we have heard that the transition will have massive implications also on the social sphere, that there's a lot of different policies that can be implemented, so there is not a one single way. We will probably not only have to discuss what is the right carbon price to get there, but there's a lot of questions on the side in terms of technology, sectors to tackle, and which policies to implement. And so this space is not over yet. There will be long discussions in the coming years on the economics of socially just transition. Thank you very much for assisting this session, and I hand over to the next session and André.